Ultimately, within 8 minutes, it went from discovery of a credential to weaponization of the service, created a backdoor for itself. We can't stay on like a traditional enterprise annual planning cycle when every 90 days the threat actor takes a step function of improvement. Actually, humans start to become part of a liability. And our liability is not our intentions. The liability is simply our speed to make correct decisions.
Hello and welcome back to Threats, Pitfalls, and Risk Myths, the TPRM Podcast. I'm your host, Nate Lee, and this week, I'm really excited to be joined by Conor Sherman. He is CISO in residence over at Sysdig and also host of the Zero Signal podcast. Now, Conor is one of those rare people who can take genuinely complex ideas and make them land clearly. His position at Sysdig puts him right at the center of one of the most important conversations in security right now, runtime defense. We're going to dig into some of the latest threat research that's coming out of Sysdig. We'll talk about why the traditional SOC model is breaking down, and then we'll discuss what security leaders actually need to do to adapt and why getting deeply hands-on with AI is no longer optional. We got a lot to talk about, so let's get into it. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Threats, Pitfalls, and Risk Myths, the TPRM Podcast. I'm very excited this week to be joined by Conor Sherman. He is the CISO in residence over at Sysdig, as well as the host of Zero Signal. Really great podcast on the security side. Thanks, Conor, for joining us.
Nate, it's awesome to be here. Thank you so much for having me today.
I'm very excited. We had some problem scheduling, which were all my part, but really excited to dive into this because I think, from the times I've chatted with you at different events and seen you present, I mean, you're just really eloquent and great when it comes to talking about some of the risks that are coming up today. And I just love diving into a lot of these things. And I think your position over at Sysdig gives you a lot of insight into sort of what the new AI-powered threat landscape looks like. So I'm really excited to dive into some of these things.
Thank you, Nate. Yeah, you are right. The role I have at Sysdig is kind of novel and unique in the sense that I get to be both an executive advisor to our customers. I get to spend a lot of time in the field talking with security leaders inside the security communities. We're both part of the CISO Society. That's an incredible community for our operating CISOs to be part of. And just all this time and energy put towards how do we collectively get better and collectively arrive to this moment that we're in, because the threat actors are just getting this massive upgrade, and it's only going to work if we stick together as security practitioners and collectively get better at our craft.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the thing that's really interesting that you mentioned there is that, a lot of the important parts are just sharing information because it's coming at us so fast, and the evolution of attacks, the evolution of our defenses and our tools. I mean, that's happening at a rate that no one's really ever seen before. And I know one of the things that's very cool is over at Sysdig, you have, threat research team. They're diving into different threats, what they're seeing out there in the wild. One of the things that caught my eye is the recent research of something from target to exploitation happening in like 8 minutes, which sort of changes the game that we're playing.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, this is a great work by the threat research team over at Sysdig. And exactly what they uncovered was their threat actor had gone from discovering a misconfigured S3 bucket that was part of a RAG, retrieve augmentation generation. RAG, I've totally spaced it. But anyway, part of the RAG architecture for AI. And what they found was that the threat actor was able to go from a misconfigured S3 bucket. There they found there was a set of credentials which were tightened permissions for just the AWS Bedrock model. But from that, the threat actor took that, went into that service, and went from that service to this whole chain of enumeration of identities, found there was another identity that it could elevate privileges to. Ultimately, within 8 minutes, it went from discovery of a credential to weaponization of the service, created a backdoor for itself, and then did something that was really interesting in my perspective, which was it then went and started to spin up these AI workloads inside of the victim's Bedrock environment. I think one of the things that's really interesting about this is because when we see threat actors attacking cloud infrastructure today, it's a little different than what we've seen historically. Because historically, it was like, okay, we're going to compromise, we're going to get into the environment, we're going to take the data, and now we're going to have a conversation about ransom.
Before we go on with the discussion, I want to share something with you that I've been building for the last 9 months to solve the problem of awful security questionnaires. They're, of course, necessary for the sales process to communicate your security posture, but it's not really high leverage work. So we built TrustMind because we want people to get back to doing what matters, securing their platforms, or shoveling snow. Really, anything besides copy-pasting answers about your firewalls and antivirus signatures for the 33rd time. TrustMind is dead simple. Just upload a questionnaire in any format or point it at a web portal, and it comes back completed in minutes. Done. Ready to submit, but without the joys of 72 new questions appearing in a portal right before you're supposed to leave for dinner, just because you answered yes to a question that asked, do you use software? TrustMind is packed with advanced features like automated conflict detection, audit trails, adjustable tone, there's a voice mode, and even a customizable self-service portal for your customers to use, complete with a chat interface. TrustMind is built by and for practitioners from people who care about the user experience and who have done hundreds of these for the world's largest companies. We want to save everyone from the pain and agony of having to explain for the third time this month why you don't have tape backups that need to be moved offsite. With TrustMind, everyone gets free and unlimited Word and Excel questionnaire automation, plus a free portal every month, forever. No trial, no credit card, just pain-free living. If this resonates with you or someone you know, head to trustmind.com and sign up for a free account now. All right, let's get back to the show.
So now we're going to have a conversation about extortion, and back and forth the threat actor goes with the victim. But what I find really interesting is we start to look at these patterns of emerging behaviors with threat actors, is that the malware, the tools, the techniques, the procedures that they're using are becoming actually dependent on AI, and they're integrating AI in a thoughtful way. So what this means is, so stay with me for a second. What this means is that, like, when you look at prompt flux, when you look at these next generation of malware, they're getting onto systems. And the first thing they're doing is they're reaching back out to an LLM and they're saying, now I'm going to give you a bunch of context around the environment. And the LLM in real time is rewriting tools, techniques for how to navigate this moment that they're in. So it's kind of this insane thing where, like, threat actor comes in, they compromise your cloud account. What are they doing? They're stealing intelligence that you're paying for. Then they're weaponizing that intelligence for the later parts of their attack sequence, because they know if they can get through the environment, and they're connected to the AWS Bedrock where they're just burning through your credits, they're using your intelligence that you're paying for to compromise, and it goes out wider. So it is a different attack chain that's happening right now. And I think, again, everyone should go read that article. It's a really good eye-opener to, like, where the state of the threat actor is going towards.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting on a couple of fronts. I mean, one, just the value of being able to use inference, like being able to take your Bedrock account, or if you're on Azure or whatever, those tokens get expensive, and attackers have value in spinning that up, kind of similar to maybe what they would have done with compute and crypto in the past. And the other thing really is just that entire time, not just to identify something, but to actually turn it into something useful. Because, you know, in the past, you'd have a S3 bucket. It's open. You leak some stuff. It's not ever going to be 8 minutes later that someone's found the credentials, figured out how to use them, and gone all on the rest of the chain, like you mentioned there. And that really does change how people have to think about defenses, and really gets to the whole runtime and being able to kind of interdict that. Otherwise, you know, if you're not looking at the alerts and it takes you 15 minutes and you need a human to go triage and see if this is real, I mean, you're way past overdue at that point by the time you get eyes on it.
So I'd like to stay on this point for a little longer, because it's such a moment for us as security leaders to engage with. And the reason is, like, if we all read the report from Anthropic back in November, where they shared with us state-sponsored actors who are coming in, and they were targeting 30 different organizations at the same time using Claude. It was really well orchestrated and implemented. And humans were doing about 10 to 20% of the work, was what the threat research said. And the balance of that, 80+%, is handled by AI agents. So we went to a world, we're now in a world where attackers, the expensive part of attacking is being focused on just these strategic pivot points. So that was a huge wake-up call for us. But of course, defenders were often behind the curve in this moment. And so now what we're seeing, and again, go back to this example, the threat research team, is this wasn't state-sponsored. This was somebody else who was a threat actor. Our intelligence puts them coming out of, I think it was Serbia, coming out of there. It's just another organized crime opportunistic person who came in and used this. So what that tells me is that this moment that we're in, it's rapidly getting democratized in the worst way possible. Like the cost of being a threat actor, the cost of success is just hitting the floor. And so as a defender, now we have to think through, like, not only how do we change our defenses, but how do we change them very quickly? Because we can't stay on like a traditional enterprise annual planning cycle when every 90 days the threat actor takes a step function of improvement. We can't be on a 1-year improvement cycle. It's quickly going to get out of hand.
And 90 days might even be a little long at this point. I mean, I think the Anthropic report from back in November, I mean, I'm sure it was just kind of a very steep curve up from there, even to where, why stop at 30 simultaneous targets, and, it can run 3,000 just as easily, with the only limit being compute.
So I think this starts to ask a really interesting question. Like, you and I are part of a lot of the same communities too. Is like, how do we start doing defense differently? Right? There's this world where we often try to be in the space of like, okay, we got to get it perfect. I've got to get everything organized. I've got to like really understand these things. And I think as defenders, there's this real shift in our defense strategy from going away from having like perfect controls to resilient design. Like, we have to be in this spot where like, we know we can't predict the future. We know it's the threat actors advancing really quickly. So everything we go through really has to, like, in my opinion, this barbell approach to it. One is you have this incredible emphasis and attention on discoverability. What's happening? Where is it happening? Where's the risk happening? What does my threat landscape look like? Let's really understand what my attack surface is. Let's understand the threat actors, where are those two meeting, what new services are spinning up in my environment. Let's understand what are the identities that are happening. Like, I got to have that really clear side of what your attack surface looks like. And then the other side is this proactive, real-time defense that's looking at every asset. Actually, so I was having this conversation with a security leader the other day, and they came in, they were talking about how they were going to try and this is like a major enterprise, and they were going to try and extend their classic EDR program to the cloud infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. I hear you. That's important to look at that. But do you realize in a cloud environment, we call it CDR, cloud defense response, specifically because you can't just look at this one universe of data. You have to look about it in context. So just for the benefit of everyone listening, it's like CDR is like, can you look at everything that's happening at runtime? Can you look at the context of the cloud configuration? Can you look at the identities and their behavior and tie all of that together into an attack chain, and then find the appropriate places that you're going to put safeguards and stopping and breakpoints if a threat actor shows up? And it's just kind of like that. Those are just a small example of like a mindset shift when you start to think about, you cannot necessarily extend what worked for the last decade into this moment. You just need to have defense platforms that are ready to do that, connect all those dots for us defenders. So in the moment when a threat actor shows up, we can start to programmatically take defensive responses.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton to unpack there. I mean, I think there's the, staying on top of threat intelligence and whatever's out there, of like what are attackers doing, what's happening out there in the world, and then how do we have our defenses ready for that, and then how do you pipe those two together? How do you think about getting that context to your systems? How do you think about having your defenses be adaptable enough that they're able to respond as these things change? And that really does require a change in mindset as far as how are we going to defend these systems? Because you can't get eyeballs on everything. You can't stay up to date on all the latest intelligence. I mean, there's just all the you can't, because the volume and the velocity ends up being so high. I mean, for you, what ends up being kind of the biggest thing that's helpful for people who haven't gotten there yet when it comes to kind of triggering that mindset shift? Like what sort of questions do you ask, or how do you think about that?
I have the privilege of spending a lot of my daytime job like focused on helping other security leaders like untangle their security program, help them have an independent perspective on some of the risks, and help them maybe in a coaching capacity or help them in an advisory capacity, one or the other. And one of the things that is a refrain of mine is come back to the principles. Right, the tactics, the techniques, the things at the top of the pyramid, they're changing a lot. There's a lot that's moving faster, but there's a lot of good principles that are going to remain persistent, that if you spend time doubling down there, you will get to reap the rewards as we change our environment. So an example of this is when we think about where a lot of enterprises are right now, they're in this moment of trying to reimagine how their enterprise is going to work with agentic workflows. It's like, how do I take this process that was historically done through people talking to people to get to an outcome, and move that to agent talking to an agent to get to an outcome? And that's the moment that we're in the business cycle here.
Yeah.
So, and this match. So what does this mean? This means we have a lot of AI workloads making their way to the cloud in one way or another. And so what I thought was really telling is what's the principle in there? Well, one of the principles is every time you have something that's going to run and is going to be performing executions, file, network, process, identity, so on and so forth, you need to have this real-time defense around it. When Joe Sullivan posts on LinkedIn, for those of you who don't know, he's the ex-CISO for Uber. He's an incredible advocate for the security community. He really, for me, sets a bar for what it means to be a tier 1 security executive. Like, I've got a lot of respect for him. And he came out this year, and his first post of the year was like, somebody asked me what the word for 2026 is. And my answer was runtime. And the reason for that came to because where the AI shift is happening, and when you look at where do we need eyes, where do we need defense, where do we need the abilities defenders to come in and take response when a threat act happens, and that's happening right there at the workload. And so going back to that conversation of like, if everything's changing so fast, what do you hold on to? Well, that's one thing to lean in on, is having like, are your systems ready to defend autonomously? And I would ask every security leader listening to this, it's like, have that honest conversation with yourself and then your deputies and then your peers inside the organization, and start thinking through, okay, how do I make my defenses ready to be autonomous? They don't have to be there today, but this is the direction the puck is going. And just that distance from saying, in November, Anthropic says you have state-sponsored threat actors, orchestrating Claude, to now you have just regular financially motivated threat actors using Claude to break into environments. That's a whole step function. That used to take 5 years previously. That happened overnight. And so now we're going to see more of this. So the only answer to that's going to be orchestrating our defenses to take action in that moment. So that's kind of one thing I go back to. We can get into the software supply chain stuff in a little bit too, but there's also a really good set of principles and things to pull from on that.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that I found, at least working with a lot of agentic systems, is like the idea of having principles ends up being much more powerful, because you can't fill up a context window with every specific thing that can go wrong. So it's now much more kind of, what are these broader principles that we care about, whether it's when looking at our own systems, how we're going to respond, having those guiding lights that you can put forward. But for people that haven't really thought through, or maybe are just getting started on their journey as far as making autonomous defenses, what sort of questions should they be asking themselves? Is it about just getting the right context? Is it about normalizing your data? Is it having the right feeds sort of centralized? What does that look like, that first step, when you talk about preparing for autonomous defenses?
It comes back to something that you and I kind of hinted at, so let's say explicitly. It's this idea of alignment on goals. Mm-hmm. And so an old way of running a security operations center would say, I'm going to take this team of people. I'm going to say, when this event happens, you have a detection sim, I want you to follow this explicit playbook. And that kind of worked. It didn't really, but we all kind of agreed it worked. It didn't. Because it led to a bunch of burnout. There's one statistic I was reading the other day. It was like 67% of all SOC analysts are like, 74% of SOC analysts said we're doing things expected by the industry, and then 67% said, and I'm burning out and I'm going to quit my job in the next year. So clearly how we've done defense previously hasn't really worked or scaled. So when it comes towards this, it's really around, how do you start aligning around goals and objectives and being really clear on boundary conditions? So this is specific for like AI systems that are coming in here. And it's getting out of this, you need to do A plus B plus C, and walking through this well-defined linear process. Instead saying on the other side, treat these systems as intelligence, say, these are your goals, here's your context, and here are your boundary conditions. That is a framework to get into. Like, start thinking along those lines. And this is everything from big to small, from AI adoption, kind of like start there. That means start with the outcome in mind and you start working backwards.
And for those boundary conditions, do you think of those more like deterministic, hard, sort of, whether it's gates or ACLs or whatever it ends up being? Or is that something more, I guess, that you're putting inside prompts and guidance for your defensive capabilities when it comes to what the boundary conditions look like?
Great. So I think there's definitely layers here. So like in anything we do, defense in depth. So let's talk about two different layers. So the first one is, yes, within the system itself, the system should have an awareness that like, if it gets into an error state, if it gets into an unknown, hits confidence level that you've said, go ahead and do the human in the loop prompt. Like, hey, I need context, need something here. That works for systems that, if they go wrong, don't have a devastating impact. And I think this is where, as a security leader, it's our job to come to the organization and help separate between what would be a bad day versus a catastrophic day. Like what's going to be like a manageable impact versus unmanageable impact, or in our parlance, outside of your risk tolerance. If it's good, so what you do there is you also have hard gates that are set independently from this. So this comes into like verifier's law. This comes into other things where you can say, if you have a system that's making decisions and it's getting closer and closer and closer to, I'm going to anchor this in an example in a second, but the closer it gets to where you are outside of your risk tolerance, that's when the gates should be the checks should be happening outside of the prompt itself. So a classic example of this starts to look like your CI pipelines. So what I would do is have your systems that are checking for your code. That's like, let's make a very simple example, secrets in code. You're checking for your secrets in code should be happening by a system that's not writing the code. It should be happening by an independent system, and ideally nice hard checks. So the further away you are from production, the more loose you can be. That's fine. You can have the rules set as context inside the prompt, but the closer and closer and closer you get to production, the more you want to see those hard red lines inside whatever your risk tolerance is, moving outside of the prompt itself and into something that's independent governance. So this might look like a governor agent, or ultimately you're going to have at some point, you're going to like, we should never see this. For instance, a critical exploitable vulnerability with a secret, like in being launched into production. Great. That should just be an independent hard check.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of it just ends up being, getting hands-on with all these different systems and sort of familiarizing yourself with like where you would draw that line and why you would draw that line. And a lot of that just comes from playing around with things. So, maybe to your earlier point, people need to start getting on these things now and really start diving in. I think one of the things, though, that's interesting that you mentioned is when do you want to call in human in the loop, and when should that happen? Because I think historically we've gone from a lot of people saying, well, every system that's making critical decisions needs a human in the loop. And that, probably is still true, but it then gets to, well, what do we define as critical decision? Because at some point, especially if we're looking at being faced by some of these large scale attacks where it can, spawn new agents and they can be doing, more than you are able to respond to in any given point in time, then you become the bottleneck as the human in the loop. And when you're talking about attackers that can move at this sort of speed, that's clearly not where any of us want to be. How do you think about that when it comes to human in the loop and where you should be letting kind of the automated defense do its thing without humans?
So historically, the conversation has been with this, as we've made this transition from deterministic software to non-deterministic software, security teams have stood in and they've viewed the AI systems, this new technology, as the risk, and the humans stepping in as the trusted state to govern this. So that kind of works until you realize what the state of the threat actor is. So let me separate two things here. Number one is, if there was no threat actor and all you were dealing with was operational components like resilient, like operational uptime, those kind of things, functionality, or you were dealing with an auditor where you knew exactly how to handle them, you knew exactly what they were looking for. In that case, sure, you might want to be biasing more and more towards humans. But my point, as I listen to more, as I work and talk with more threat researchers and come to understand the state where we have with the threat actor, I'm coming to realize it's like that model that kind of emerged right at the beginning of the LLM genesis, where we had this come through, that's no longer sufficient. And so we start to think about the environment through the lens of the threat actor, actually humans start to become part of the liability. And our liability is not our intentions. The liability is simply our speed to make correct decisions. So what I would say to anyone who's kind of wrestling between where do we have human in the loop and where do we start handing these things off agentically, I'll offer you and say, like, it's not an easy conversation. It's a hard one to have, but it's an important one to have, because I think where we're going to land and where I think people should be going with quickly is you start to think through what are the scenarios that we cannot afford to have a threat actor win. What is the data that we cannot lose? What is the compromise that we're not willing to tolerate? And in those environments, you start to say, we actually want AI systems making defined defensive decisions without humans approving them. And so I know that kind of like jars a lot of people. So here's a thought around this. It's like, we know what bad looks like. We got a lot of good data on this. If I have a container that starts reaching into a data store and it starts looking for credentials through that, like, that's just not normal behavior. Like, you shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah.
If I start to see role chaining in my environment where like one identity assumes another role, which assumes another role, that's not normal behavior. You shouldn't be seeing that. So we actually have a ton of, as a community, really good intelligence of what around bad looks like. And that's really indicative of there being a threat actor. So for the environment, for the signals that you feel that your organization signed off, like, we agree that like when you cross this threshold, it's got to be bad, then you should just be automating your responses. And if you're like, I don't know about automating responses, then I would say go back and check, do you actually trust those signals, right? So if you trust the signals and you believe the impact on the business is going to be that material, then you should let go and say, okay, we need to have the systems take responsive action. And a good example, a really important thing that's emerging, it's always been important to the cybersecurity community, but more now than ever, is the fact that like open source defensive technologies are really going to, I think they're just really going to see, they're going to have their moment here. Because when you have something that is clear and is transparent and is community driven, then you can start to really quickly operationalize intelligence that's coming from around the globe. It comes in, and now that defensive system you have in place can take action. So in our particular case, like I'm with Sysdig. Sysdig's got the Falco. Falco's a cloud native defense platform.
Yep.
It's used by like, I think it's like 60% of the Fortune 500.
You guys are full CNCF graduated project. I mean,
exactly. CNCF graduated. And what that means is every single time we find activity for a threat actor and we create the next set of rules that says this is bad, everyone around the globe gets an update and they go, cool. Now we know when we see this, we can do this. So there's this sense of like the old model would say, every time you see something bad, go ahead and create a JIRA ticket or route that to my SOC. Or in most architectures, it's like, take this telemetry, put it into a SIM, churn through all of that, then send it to a level 1, we send it to level 2, and then send it to level 3. And that just fundamentally is just not going to work when we can find someone who can go from 0 to admin in AWS in under 8 minutes.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, one of the things ends up being just, again, maybe talking about change of mindset is understanding that some of the rules and stuff you set up with automated responses isn't going to be perfect, but really just thinking about this as something where you're looking at continuous improvement and compound engineering, all of those things of like, if it had a miss, how do you just make sure you keep building on that? And again, thinking about like the principles that caused it, because you can't just whack-a-mole every possible thing that can go wrong. So thinking through what's the line of thinking that led this to go wrong, and then how do we sort of embody those principles into whether it's prompts or kind of the guidance. And I think that's a different mindset shift that people need to take into account as well.
So there's some really good optimism here in what you said. A couple of things here. So one is that if you think about the moment we're heading into, let's assume you take the facts that I just laid out as the direction. And they're not flukes, these are trends. And I really believe they are based on everything that's coming out. What you see is that you get to a world where, as defenders, if we start to make these systems more programmatic in our defenses and more agentic, what do you have to do? You have to write them down. You have to take these set of instructions. They're in markdown files. They're change managed. You're in your GitHub. So the next time you come through, it's like, okay, we didn't really like that. We did our postmortem and we didn't like the outcome. We wanted to be slightly different. We want the analysis to be different. We want the response action to be different. You just update the system once. And forever it is different. And like, there's actually this really cool thing about like, as defenders, so much of our institutional knowledge, what we're expected to do in the moment, came through like this raw experience, just like being face to face with threat actor over and over and over again across different environments. Now we get to say we've learned it once, we write it down, and forever it's forever in the canon of how we're going to defend this particular environment. And this is really good. This means our defenses can get much better far more quickly, because it's just easier to do that than to constantly try and like retrain the defenders over and over again, who are understaffed, stretched too thin, and are being asked to protect a surface that they just can't possibly monitor and truly understand the risk around and truly take all these defense actions in. So there's actually this optimistic perspective of like, if we adopt this mindset where we write it down through these markdown files, if we're integrating it into the right place across the organization and we're taking programmatic perspectives on our defenses, they can get much better. So again, want to take the optimistic perspective there, that we actually stand a really good chance as a community, but it does require that mind shift change, that it's like we need to start putting humans where they're needed, not where we think they should be, right? We kind of let go of 2021, 2022 idea of human in the loop and say, actually, our defenders need to be strategic and our defenders need to be governing the system, not flipping bits and bytes.
Yeah, I think that governance thing and just really doing a lot of the critical thinking ends up being important, because you're going to have all these markdown files, and I think it gets to the agents end up fulfilling the need where, previously we said, well, you can't have computers do that because they can screw up or do this and that. And it turns out the humans are probably going to screw some of these things up more than the agents, especially as that body of knowledge grows. That context is really what I think is going to set defense ahead of attackers eventually, because you will have all the knowledge, the context of your systems, you'll have all the hooks in place. So even though the attackers will be extremely fast, you'll be faster because you'll have the telemetry and you'll be not flying blind as opposed to them. But the other thing ends up being, again, to mindset shifts, like thinking through about building the context that you're talking about, the markdown files, all the detections, and having it be where, we're going to find as you start scaling these that, oh, okay, now we found out when the markdown file gets too big, you need to break it up. And how do we understand how agents work? And in what way should we now restructure this so that it's, doing progressive disclosure? How do you get the right info at the right time? And that's the stuff I think that your humans should be spending time on, because that's where the agents won't be able to help themselves necessarily without that direction, is staying abreast of like, how do we get these systems to grow in a cohesive way and stay effective? Because the ground is shifting under our feet right now, and it's just, your team needs to be like snapping, moving fast on staying on top of all of this.
Yeah. So just two thoughts on that. It's like, we have a brand new technology. And the last time we had a brand new technology was like the 90s. And we were like, there's this internet thing. How's it going to come along? And
I thought you were talking about air fryers, but.
So if you think about that, it's like we had all of this growing up to do. And as a cybersecurity community, we had to like really think through, and we went through this evolution. We should expect the same, but faster. Like there is going to be a change in how we do defense.
That's the big key, the speed.
Yes, the speed is fundamentally shifted and changed. I want to say that. So as a security leader, if you're like looking at the mirror and you're like, I don't have all the answers, welcome to the club. Like nobody has the playbook yet. We're just figuring out. So the two things that we can do is we can be really clear about the data. We can we can really be anchored in good principles. I would think the cybersecurity community is actually really good at this. We think pretty deeply and we put out these wonderful frameworks around how we're going to do defense in depth, how we're going to do a secure software deployment lifecycle, how we're going to do these things. But historically, like the NIST agencies will come out and they'll say, here's how you want to do zero trust architectures. Cool. And it really doesn't get implemented, or it's slowly implemented, or you have a plethora of examples of this. The other one I was going for was the Google's framework on attestations, and the name just totally escaped me there. But it's just salsa. Thank you. I had to think of chips and guacamole, and I got to salsa. See, that's how the chain of reasoning goes for Conor. So, like says for much, we know that having providence over our code and being able to have a good signing process is important, but we've not really had the business buy-in, or B, the capabilities to like do this at scale and at speed. So that's why I came back to
other burning fires.
Exactly. So, but now we can look back on this body of knowledge that we've known, like, oh, okay, yes, software supply chain security is really important. We actually have moments now where we can go back and say, hey, we recognize that depending on the study, it's between 20 and 48% of libraries that are referenced by agentic coding systems are hallucinated. That's a really good moment to anchor your team on and say, okay, we are now going to go fix software supply chain. And because we need to make sure our packages are at least coming through trusted repositories, and we have cool off periods, and we have these fundamentals that we would do, that will help in combating this because we can steal from prior art.
And we've talked about a bunch about this, just the, do you patch fast or do you patch, slightly slow, and, all of the things when it comes to pulling in third-party libraries, because just exploiting them ends up being much easier in the past. And attackers are seeing this as a place where they can really put high-value attacks in, like the whole XZ thing that happened last year. I mean, I think that's probably a good example that, I don't think humans would catch that in general, but I don't think agents would catch that either. And so some of this ends up being, where do you draw that line? Definitely, I mean, supply chain ends up being something that is going to be more and more important as we're delivering software faster, and people aren't, if you don't have controls in place, they're not looking at what libraries get pulled in, what dependencies are there.
And this leads us to something that we're going to head into in our economy is going to be trust is going to be a premium. Mm-hmm. And I think security leaders have a real opportunity to help enterprises in this moment. Whereas historically, we've been very focused on, can we stop the adversary? There's actually the other side of that coin, which is, can we build the program that we can communicate to our stakeholders, whether they're customers, partners, regulators, that we are trustworthy? There's the other side of that coin. So in a world where things are moving this fast, in a world where everybody knows it's moving this fast, and the risk, particularly the cybersecurity risk, is a clear and present topic on every executive's mind. Like, you can't read a business journal and not have someone talk about the cybersecurity risk implications of this. They don't have the answer, but they're really clear that there's a problem. And so as a CISO, as a security leader, there's actually this very much this opportunity to say, like, we're going to kind of level up our role and level up our engagement to be the executives who lean in and help establish a program that not just stops bad, but creates trust.
Yeah. And I think, to your point, and this is for folks in security anywhere more broadly, obviously applies to CISOs quite a bit, but to anyone in security, there really hasn't been much of an opportunity like this when it comes to being a business enabler, because right now, your CEO is getting it from the board, the executive team is getting it from the CEO. Like, what are you doing to enable AI? And a lot of them, of course, have ideas. There's tools, there's this and that. But most of them don't understand how to balance that with risk in any sort of meaningful way. And so if you're coming in, not just, hey, you can't do this because this could go wrong, but helping really think through not only how do you manage the risk, but even like, well, have you thought about this problem this way? Because by nature, we're going to be very deeply involved in understanding how these systems work, which really sets you up to understand how this can apply in new ways that people haven't thought about, and puts you as a business enabler in ways that you just couldn't do before when your job was configuring ACLs and, hardening images and all of that stuff.
The opportunity for security leaders to be a business enabler has definitely gotten the step function improvement. If we look back over the last 10 years, the narrative of being a business enabler was really around this. How do we stop being the office of no to being the office of like, yes, and, oh, you want to go do that? Cool, we'll do that, but they have to have a SOC too. Oh, you really want to put your data over here? Okay, we'll do that, but we're going to throw this particular control in it. I'm saying like that was okay for that time. What we have now is an opportunity to come through and say, the enterprise that's trying to sell a product, or every enterprise that someone is delivering a service or delivering a product to someone else. And on the other side of that is a consumer or a regulator who's saying, how do I know that you're going to be there tomorrow? How do I know that you're going to be present when the environment gets adverse, when you're under a DDoS attack, when you have a supply chain compromise, when you have someone compromising your systems and they're going through, how do you protecting that data in the fault environment? So we actually can step up in this moment as security leaders and not just be the yes and, but be more of the executive guiders, the beings of the tech, the members on the executive team who can help guide where the business is going to go in this particular moment. And I don't think we've had this before. Like, the role of the CISO has always been to find the risk, to price the risk, and then coach through it. Like, it's find, price, and coach. And but historically, we've had real headwinds on that coaching where like you're trying to coach to remediation. Not everything belongs to the CISO to go fix, but we often have a really good sense of the data and a good sense of the operating environment that we're in. And we need to be in this spot where we were coaching the business. Like I mentioned, before AI, there was always like the value of doing that versus the cost trade-off it wasn't in our favor. But now, if every business is being rebuilt and going from legacy technology into AI first technology, there's a lot of unknowns. And this is our opportunity to get really clear on how we discover and how we price the risk and arrive to the executive team, arrive to our peer group and say, here is a way to do this and mitigate the risks, because nobody in this room can say that they have the answers, because we collectively don't know what the future holds. One of my son's favorite little sayings at the moment is, Daddy, you can't predict the future. I'm like, you are right.
And you're like,
it's still bedtime.
Very true. But I can't predict next week.
Exactly. But what we can do is we can design for defense in depth. We can design for proactive defenses, and we can have a good strategy that's based in principles, so that as the landscape changes from where it is today to the unknown of tomorrow, we're at least defensively postured to handle it without losing all the upside. So, because I think that's the other thing I'm thinking through too, is you see a lot of organizations and they're in this moment of like existential crisis. They're like, we need to like rebuild everything with AI. That's not a bad direction to head into, but the how matters.
Great idea. I don't know how you came up with that. That's amazing.
But the how matters a lot, right? It's like if we just replatformed without thinking it through, we are not going to see the benefit that we want. And I think this
gets into the why. Like what problem are we trying to solve? And I think that's where security can also help out, like making sure we're doing the right things for the right reasons and in the right way.
Yes, I think there's a lot to be said there. We know, and every one of the leadership team has their own strengths that come into this. Just the CISO has this moment where we can really, I think about this as like the evolution of the CISO is heading in this direction of a trust officer. Regardless of what we call it, it's beyond just security. Like security has to be present. Like the environment has to be free of an adversary, but it has to have safety. Like, are these systems that we're building operating within the parameters we're expecting them to operate? And is it reliable? Is this environment, is this system, is this subsystem, is our company going to be available in an adverse circumstance? And I think those three things are really going to be part of the DNA of the next generation of CISOs who really succeed in this moment of transition.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, it's a great opportunity for people that see it coming and are able to kind of adapt and jump on this, because I think one of the other things is folks across the board are looking for guidance, because there's just so much new and really, I think the fact that we are working with engineering and understanding how the systems work, we're trying to automate our own stuff, which is going to involve really getting down there. It just gives such insight, because a lot of this, you can only read so much about LLMs and agents and whatever in a book. A lot of it, you really do need to be hands-on to understand, where's the value, where's the pitfalls, how do you kind of get the most out of the system? And that really sets us up to be kind of really at the forward edge when it comes to how the systems work, how to build them, how to optimize them. And that means you can just be so much more valuable to anyone in sales and marketing, HR, whatever, across the board than we have been in the past, where it's like, oh, I'll show you how to set up access controls in Workday or something so that everything stays safe. It's now we're going to have these insights that I'd really encourage people to share and to think through, because you're going to see things that others won't, just by virtue of being so exposed to all of these systems and understanding how they work, because you need to in order to be defending.
Call for like security leaders to get close to the metal again, to like crack open Claude Code and like just start experimenting is so true. So as I mentioned, like I spend a lot of my time talking with peers in the industry, and one theme I've heard over the last 3 months has been this generalized AI anxiety across cybersecurity. And it's like this security leaders are really struggling in this moment, because it's kind of like the cobbler's kids. Every executive in any company has this mandate: rebuild your organization AI first, because we want to see the reduction in OpEx. We want to see the increase in growth. They're like the mandate is there. Okay. But the security leader has the dual mandate. They need to do that just like any other executive. But they also at the same time have to provide governance and advising and security for all the others. And what's happening in my perspective is that we're seeing a lot of security leaders indexing to help their peer group, because they're trying to do what they naturally do, which is defend the organization. And so they're coming in, they're spending a lot of time with the marketing teams and the engineering teams and the revenue teams. And then all of a sudden, who's not getting attention? The security teams. And there's a feeling of just getting crushed by this wave of change that's happening to such a degree that I'm like, actually at RSA, for, I don't know when we're releasing this podcast, but at RSA, we've got a session, which is a breakfast for CISOs to come in to talk about exactly this. It's like, how can we help each other on ramp and onboard ourselves into AI more quickly? Because if we as security leaders don't get hands-on again and understand like intuitively in our bones how the system works, how these things work at some version of scale, how clusters of agents work together, if we don't get into that headspace and we don't get that in our bones, our ability to be effective advisors to the business and effective defenders of who we're hired to defend, it's just going to go down to zero. And so for the sake of our own careers, our teams, and our companies, we as collectively, the security leadership, do need to get back to the technology. And honestly, the answer of like, oh, I helped the company get ISO 42001 isn't a good enough answer anymore.
Yeah. And I mean, really just from my own experience, like it's actually super fun when you dive into it. You start to kind of playing around with some of this stuff. So, I mean, I think it really behooves everyone to kind of embrace that creativity and curiosity, not only in yourselves, but like, how do you foster that in your teams, your coworkers, company-wide? Because I think, you know, when we think about the CISO role, right? Like your job is to manage risk, but one of the things that sort of, you know, maybe is obvious, but maybe gets missed is that moving, like the speed that you're moving, that you're delivering services, you're releasing new functionality, like that is another business risk, just like cybersecurity is. And so, you know, how do you can help manage that one as well? Like, how do you help all these other teams to move quickly and securely at the same time? And you're kind of like hitting both at the same time because they're two sides of the same equation. It's risk from velocity, risk from cybersecurity, and then whatever value from delivering quickly. And I think it really would work in a lot of people's favor to make sure they're weighing both of those, because moving slowly is a death sentence for a company these days. And I mean, it's something we just need to internalize in how do we enable that in a secure manner.
That's actually a really good point. And if we think about that in the classic risk matrix of like input, impact, and likelihood, we don't typically view our risk registers as an object that lives through space and time. We think of them as static. And as you rightly said, it's like the risk profile of these things is going to change over time, and they're going to move from low risk to high risk the more time we give it. So if you've got an organization that can't get to market, or more subtly, they just can't onboard the next set of agents to help their growth team take care of their daily operational activities, or you can't onboard these systems and integrate them effectively, and we say, okay, we're going to take 6 months to do that, like they may have missed the moment. So part of our mandate as security leaders is to like meet the business where they are at the speed that they are without us becoming part of the frantic herd. Like we have to do both those things and remain like the cool-headed adults in the room who are thinking through what are the first and second order implications of making these changes. So again, not an easy job, but I think it's the job that the moment's calling us to.
Yeah, and I mean, it does raise an interesting sort of dichotomy then where you end up with, okay, we need to move fast. I'm trying to enable you to move fast, but obviously the faster people move, the more likely mistakes, shortcuts are taken that lead to decreased security. I mean, how do you think about the role and just security more generally when it comes to, you know, surfacing that and making sure, because you want to be, everybody wants to enable the business, but at the same time, sometimes that might be undercutting your other mandate, which is, you know, make sure things are secure. How do you think about just making sure that that balance is heard and seen and documented, I suppose, at some level?
This is maybe where I differentiate from the herd a little bit, and I have like a different point of view. I do believe you are right that most people, when they think of the security leader and the role, they think the purpose of a security leader is to like stop a breach. And I'm like, not quite. Our job is to be really clear about the risk. It's like to find, price, and coach. It's to find the risk and help coach. And then the second says, oh, it's our job to enable the business. I'm like, well, no, I'm not giving a 14-year-old keys to the car. Like that's not happening either. So as a risk professional who's that, maybe our job is actually more grounded in language like to help the business grow and mature to a more resilient state. And we're going to do that and be informed by the state of the threat actor because that's the principal thing that we're defending against. So if we think about this less around these black and white, are we secure or are we not secure, to how are we more resilient today than we were yesterday in the face of an adversary? I think that puts us in a much better framing as a security leader in this moment, because it means we don't have to be perfect. because no one else can be perfect. And when we get rid of that internal dialogue, okay, I got to get this right. Otherwise, like, well, actually, the minute you get rid of that, then you kind of join the rest of the executive team in the messy reality that they're in, because they already realized a long time ago, they're not going to be perfect. So you got to be, now it comes into like, how do you do this well as a CISO, how to be someone who's an adult, who's a risk oriented executive, who's really focused on delivery and speed. Then I think you start to anchor to what I said earlier, resiliency. You start to build towards trustworthiness. Can you deliver assurance that your system is free of adversary? Is it operating in the safeguards and will be resilient in the face of an adverse circumstance? Okay, we're getting towards trustworthiness. Now we're in the place where we can be far more effective as security leaders in this particular moment.
Yeah, but I think all of those things just end up being tied together with like enablement. Like you're enabling all of these things, and that sort of is the portion of the role is how do we enable resilience? How do we enable teams to do this securely? How do we enable them to move quickly? And I mean, I think it's about as exciting as a time as there ever has been to be in a security role, just because.
Yeah, this is the best time to be alive. This is the best time to be in cybersecurity. I would just say be really good at documenting risk management. If we get into the other side of being a professional security, if you our role is like we are professional risk executives, then we do need to be thinking about what are the risks that we're taking on and what is the cumulative effect of the risks that we're taking on. This is one of the things I see a lot with younger security leaders is that when they first get into the role, they think enablement means saying yes to the request in front of you. It's like, no, enablement means help the business achieve the stated objective that we're after, and doing that and coming alongside in that way. And part of that means like, okay, cool, we're going to take on risk in these areas. Beautiful. Business should be taking on the risk. They exist to take on risk. That's why they're there, because we're trying to get somewhere and we're not going to get there with no risk. Now, that said, if you're the security leader who's saying, cool, let's go, I'm going to give you my blessing because we're going to do X. Number one, you should never be in a spot where you're like giving a blessing for something. That puts you in a terrible spot. Your job is to find the risk, clearly are documented, and say, you as the business leader feel informed. I'm not just giving you a document, we're talking through, we're coaching through it, but I've informed you of what's happening and I'm giving you that extra perspective. The risk lives with the business. If something happens and it's like, and the decision is made that's clearly outside the risk tolerance of the business, goes against policy, you're unsure of it as a security leader in the moment, it is your job to have a folder called memo to file in your corporate Google Drive or your O365 or whatever. And every time that happens, you write it down. This was a simple practice that was given to me by a general counsel I worked with and reported to a long time ago. And it was just like, make sure there's a document that says that. What was the information that was available at the time? What were decisions made? Who was in the room? Write it down, have it independently artifact, and put it aside. Hopefully you never need to go read that document. But if push comes to shove, you had a memo that was contemporary with the events. And that's just a good thing. So with that defensive process in place, then you go back into enablement is like not necessarily saying yes in the moment. It's saying coaching them and helping push the organization to where it wants to go over the long term.
Yeah, and I think, some people think of that as CYA, which, to some extent, I suppose it is, but it's also worth it to have because second guessing, in hindsight is really easy. And it is something where mistakes are going to happen. You're going to make decisions that don't pan out. And maybe it was or wasn't the right decision. It could be, you just took a calculated risk. You have a poker hand and there's a certain mathematical decision that is the correct one. And even if you make it, you lose the hand. That doesn't mean it was a bad decision. But maybe you did make a bad decision. Either way, you want to be able to have that so you can look back whenever it comes up in the future and be able to say, okay, did we not have the right information? Did we have the right information? Did we not interpret it in the right way? And just, how do you use this to drive continuous improvement is always a big one for me of when it comes to any of this stuff. But I think the CYA thing is also extremely valuable if you're ending up in a place where the organization turns hostile.
Or if you're publicly traded. These are kind of all basics and these are just environments. Think about this. Every general counsel you've ever worked with is doing what I just said. They have a folder. They're not talking about it. They keep it down. Why? It's just good risk management practice. Now, going to the positive side of this conversation, the other side, we
need to end on a good note here.
We got to leave on a great note here. There is a great moment to be a security leader right now. And one of the things that I'm most encouraged by is a couple of them. One of them is we have this moment to help businesses as they re-platform their technology from legacy technology into AI first technology, to embed security as a first principle order in a way that we've never been able to done before. We touched on this earlier where we talked about having context for AI agents and providing them guidance right there through instructions. Think about this. Every single person who's going to listen to this has gone through some version of software security training where we listened to something that was pre-recorded for 10 minutes and it told us all about the OWASP top 10, and we went through this training and it had some effect. Let's not say no effect, but it had some effect. But it wasn't great. Now, every single time an AI agent goes to generate code, if you're a security leader, you can have your security files right there in context. And it's saying, when you go to generate this code, be mindful of these common practices that lead to vulnerable code. When you want to pull down a library, we use this package manager, not these. And you can bring all this context and knowledge about what it means to do security well into these agents. So there's this moment of optimism where we as security leaders can help CTOs, we can help our technical counterparts redeploy how they do code building, code generation, application design.
Yep.
And integrate security to the first principle. And I think that's one small example of like why it's an exciting moment to be a security leader right now.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think it's that you can do, there's tools to help with it. It's basically how you could scale what was previously limited by the amount of heads you had in AppSec to now, AI-based tool that can do threat modeling, that can do the code review afterwards. It's all these things you would have never done one-to-one with a human because it would just be too expensive. But now all of this is suddenly accessible in ways that weren't before, and you get greater velocity out of it at the same time.
And take a look at no further than the latest release from Anthropic. You have Opus 4.6. It runs over open source projects, and what does it find? 500 undisclosed high and critical vulnerabilities and open source stuff. You're finding it reasoning through problems differently. I know everyone had like a moment about this on the collective socials, but I'm like, wonderful. I would love something integrated into my systems.
Yeah.
You know how hard we fight as CISOs to get security software into the IDE? We spent 10 years trying to get there. And then Cloud Code's like, hey, let's just turn on the security feature inside of Cloud Code. And now everyone has access to a base version of vulnerability discovery. I'm like, I think that's really, again, another great example of like how the transition we're going through can be positive for defenders. The next step is
all you got to do is take advantage of it.
Yes.
Well, this has been a great chat. I mean, thanks so much for coming on. I love diving into all of this stuff with you because you always have such great insights, such cool insights, and you always put things forward in such a easily digestible manner as well.
Well, thank you, Nate. I appreciate that. And I would just encourage anyone who wants, any defender right now, like go find a few trusted sources of people who understand what a threat actor is and pay attention to that. And let's get outside of our bubble of just defenders talking to defenders and really integrate those who are researching the threat actors, whether it's a Sysdig research team or others, because as defenders, the closer we understand like the shift that's happening on the other side here, the better we'll be prepared to be in the right frame of mind to have the right security strategies to deal with that.
Yep. I mean, and it's, it's helpful for prioritization, but also exactly like you said, it's that mindset shift. Like, how do you understand how they're thinking about the problem? Not what are they doing, but like, what is it that's enabling them to do this? And then taking that a step further, what will that enable them to do? So you can go where the puck is going to be, I guess, so to speak. I mean, it really does require a bit of mindset shift for folks, but I think, there's again, never been a better time to be diving into it.
This is not the moment to be overtly cautious. It's like lean in, get hands on, and start paying attention to where the puck is going because we're getting there much faster than we've ever done.
Totally agree. Well, thanks again for joining. Really, really glad that we were able to catch up with you. And thanks everybody for listening. Until next time. Thanks for listening to the TPRM Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe and share it with a colleague. You can find more insights and resources over at tprmpodcast.com. And until next time, remember, trust nothing, verify most things, and keep building. That's it for this episode of the TPRM Podcast. I'm Nate Lee. Thanks for joining me and my guest today. If you found this conversation valuable, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app, leave us a review, and share the episode with your peers and colleagues. For more resources and insights on building business-aligned security programs and managing vendor security, visit tprmpodcast.com and connect with me on LinkedIn. We'll see you next time.